I've been reflecting on a topic that's been taking over the media: diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DEI. You've probably seen big creators like Asmongold or Moist Critical weigh on this, but today I want to share my perspective. And hey, if by any chance Asmongold is watching this, hi Asmon. In case he just paused the video, let me continue from where I left off. To put it simply, it's terrible. But not because of what it is, but because of how it's implemented. Let me elaborate. DEI isn't a bad concept in itself if we read it as it is on paper, but the way it's being put into practice, that's where the problem starts. The DEI, or Organizational Frameworks for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, seek to promote the fair treatment and full participation of all people, particularly groups who have historically been underrepresented or subject to discrimination on the basis of identity or disability. At least that's what Wikipedia seems to say. Other words associated with this framework are belonging, justice, and accessibility. You know, fancy words you would put on your resume to get a job at McDonald's, only to get rejected for not having 6 years of experience or for being too old. Suffice to say that if we are talking in regular human terms, we should all agree that these conditions on media should not be only accepted but also embraced with open arms, right? Well, in theory, yes, but that's the issue. It's not being implemented, it's being enforced, and that's the problem there. For example, let's look at the gaming industry. DEI has become a big part of recent games like Concord, Dustborn, and Awakening, as well as long-running franchises like Assassin's Creed and Rainbow Six Siege, just to name a few. On the surface, these changes seem to aim for inclusivity, but the way they are implemented can feel clunky or out of place. The main objectives of companies such as Sweet Baby Inc., GamerX, Mendes Consulting LLC, and even private consultants such as Anita Sarkeesian and Quinn Titus is to implement checkmarks for all the things that seem to be missing in a game, and that's the key word. If you have a game about Viking history or Viking lore, do you need to include an African woman in a wheelchair? If you have a game about a medieval siege, do you need a lecture on capitalism and redistribution of wealth according to what's presented in the ideology of Marxism? Of course, these are extreme scenarios that haven't happened and would likely appear as exaggerations to prove a point, but in the end, as ridiculous as they are, they do feel out of place, correct? Certainly, if you are the owner of the IP and decide to go into this direction, unless you've got a huge group of investors waiting to make a profit, nothing is truly stopping you from doing so. But when the backlash from the audience is big enough for people to refuse to buy it, can you really blame the audience? After all, there is a small concept that can be implemented in every possible business, which is the law of supply and demand. The more people want a thing, the more they are willing to pay it. If nobody wants to buy it, nobody will sell it again. Unless you are the Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League, who dropped the price to $5 out of desperation to make any sort of profit. My point is, when so many people retaliate against these actions being presented in video games, can you really blame the consumer? Apparently yes, since these companies seem to get a mass of gaslighters taken from the cesspool of the internet to tell everyone that they are either racist, homophobic, transphobic, or any other variant of the book of basics for internet insults. Nonetheless, I'd like to go back to the key word that I mentioned earlier, which was missing. The reason these things were enforced on a video game is because they were not present in the original product. But is it really missing if the developers are trying to be consistent? It reminds me of how storytelling in games used to feel so much more natural, where diversity was implemented in a way that enriched the story rather than shoving a message down our throats. Think about Resident Evil 5 Sheva Alomar, a strong black woman fighting alongside Chris Redfield. Her inclusion made sense in the story and added depth to the game without feeling forced. Or take Faith Connors from Mirror's Edge, an Asian woman navigating in a dystopian world with her agility and grit. These characters didn't need a spotlight to stand out. They were just integral to the world around them. Now let's circle back to a current instance of this, which is Assassin's Creed Shadow. This game features Yasuke, an African slave brought to Japan in 1579, alongside Naoe, a Japanese assassin. Yasuke's inclusion makes sense historically, but it's a noticeable shift from the series' usual approach of focusing on protagonists native to the setting. This isn't about rejecting diversity, it's about storytelling consistency. Yasuke could have been an incredible ally, a key piece to the narrative, while still keeping the primary focus on Naoe. That balance would have felt more in line with the series' roots. While it is true that historical figures have appeared in previous Assassin's Creed games, these were there mainly to provide support to the protagonist of the story, rather than to take control of it. I am not saying necessarily that Yasuke shouldn't exist whatsoever, or that his character should only be included as part of the DLC, but a much more reasonable and sensitive approach would have been for him to be a key piece to the story, an ally to rely on during the events of this game. But hey, this must be asking too much to the company that made you have a fist fight with the Pope as a final boss fight. Or is it? Because yes, it is ridiculous to think of that fight, but with today's technology and access to new creative minds, they could have easily delivered one of the best stories in the franchise. Instead, we get promotional videos of Yasuke being the key character every time, rather than giving that spot to another male Japanese character. And not even that, to the other protagonist of the story, the Japanese female assassin. Also, before you say there weren't any black characters in any Assassin's Creed games, Adewale in Freedom Cry, Aveline in Liberation, and Bayek in Origins. Therefore, shut up. And it's not like gamers have an issue with diversity itself. Just look at Half-Life 2's Alyx Vance. As a biracial woman with a pivotal role in one of the gaming's most beloved franchises, she became an icon without the need for heavy-handed messaging. Or consider Beyond Good and Evil's Jade, whose determination and depth made her story unforgettable. These characters were celebrated because they belonged in the worlds they were part of. But when these ideas feel shoehorned, audiences push back. And understandably so. Let's not forget Rainbow Six Siege. When the game introduced Scopos, an operator in a wheelchair, the concept didn't really sound promising since Rainbow Six is a game about movement, but her mechanics did feel promising to a certain point. She remotely controls robots to defend areas, which could have worked, except for the fact that it made you question why other operators weren't using similar tech to stay out of danger. You know, since everyone could die. Compare that to Aruni, an amputee operator whose story and gameplay mechanics were embraced by the community. Aruni felt authentic, while Scopus, despite good intentions, ended up feeling like a checkbox addition. But the main concern with DEI is that it defeats its own purpose and contradicts itself, as it created an issue that was being resolved long before these things existed. If we look back between 2000 and 2014, we find some of the most beloved games that integrated diversity without making it the sole focus. The Last of Us gave us Ellie, a lesbian protagonist navigating a world falling apart, and players connected with her because her story felt real. In The Walking Dead by Telltale, Lee and Clementine, a black man and a young girl, delivered a heartbreaking journey that still resonates with fans. And who could forget CJ from Grand Theft Auto San Andreas? You know, not only was he one of the most iconic black protagonists, but his game is still considered the best in the GTA series. These characters worked because the games prioritized great storytelling. These characters weren't just their skin color or ethnicity. They truly felt like the protagonist of the stories. They were written for those stories. They weren't shoved in it just to prove a point. And no, this is not nostalgia speaking. There is a reason why there is a phrase called "it aged like fine wine." Because these games are considered amazing storytelling tools even by today's standards. They touched on political and social issues like a regular person would do. They didn't need to shove their ideology down your throat, gaslight us into thinking we are the world's worst enemy and that we should feel bad about ourselves and pay $150 for a DLC to go fuck ourselves. Even if we're talking about being inclusive enough, you don't really need to be an expert on the topic to understand that games have come a long way, not only when it comes to storytelling but through technical aspects. Let me explain. Seizure warnings for epileptic people, ESRB to indicate which audience the game is suitable for, button remapping for special controllers for handicapped people. Hell, even for a company that makes a mess after mess, even Sony released an official controller for those who don't have the physical capabilities to hold a regular controller, just so anyone can enjoy their games. Something even as simple as graphics customization, where players could optimize the graphics settings so the game can run in the system without the need of having a high-end PC. Of course, not every game will work flawlessly, but the option is there at least. So to say that games aren't inclusive is a joke, because it's the diverse stories that united gamers to begin with. The thing is that gamers never really cared. Will you encounter an actual racist that fights for the prohibition of dark skin or LGBTQ characters? Of course you will. In the same amount, you'll find a dandelion that throws money when you blow it, you British meatball. I've heard the most horrific, anti-Semitic and disgusting things while playing online from gaming parties that literally had one white guy in the group. You will find trolls online who will do everything in their reach to piss you off, but in their everyday life, they do not even think about racism. On the other hand, the actual sympathizers of segregation are such a minority that they need to join in the cesspool of Twitter to even be considered a group. The world has been inclusive even before you got your PhD of History of Racism summarized in the last 300 years of North American history. I still remember how much of an outrage Resident Evil 5 provoked simply because it took place in Africa. But let's not forget that the outbreaks took place in the US, Paris, China, and even Spain. And I have seen not a single person online complaining about how the Spanish Granados had a Mexican accent rather than a Spanish one. And you know why? Because the game was awesome either way. The Spanish-speaking community admired the game for what it was, despite the fact that it depicted Spaniards as Europeans from the 19th century. But an African setting was an interesting choice, but not a racist one. I've seen people complaining about how the fictional country of Juju provides a negative stereotype to African countries as being poor or underdeveloped. I'm sorry, but if a deadly virus that turns people into monsters were to spread in the city I live in, I would be baffled if it didn't look like a war zone. Also, this is Kijuju by the way, and this is Gazibe in Kenya. I rest my case. If any critic is absolutely agreeable on is that they should have removed the piss filter and that's it. It's also important to understand that not every game needs DEI to be front and center. Take Black Myth Wukong for example. Critics complain about its lack of inclusivity, but the game is based on Chinese mythology. It's trying to stay true to its cultural roots, and forcing in diversity just for the sake of it would dilute its authenticity. Also, the fact that they are using DEI simply as a metric that companies can use to demonstrate their adherence to socially conscious hiring and management practices. Instead, use it to think who you're targeting to sell it to and for what purpose, rather than placing investors that will end up ruining your company. Just think about it. If everything is diverse, just by pure math, you end up destroying the concept of diversity as it is. If everything is mixed, then nothing is. Oh, but media and games have always been progressive, which is exactly my point. They are trying to reinvent the wheel when even long ago we've been succeeding in creating these diverse ideas. So what are they trying to do here? Audiences don't hate diverse characters. What they hate is being slammed as bigots for rejecting bad work from pretentious, unskilled activists posing as writers. If the demographic of your characters becomes more important than the story, your story will probably suck, and that is a fact, not a theory. How can you call a game diverse when you're forced to put a person of certain identity, gender, sexuality, or ethnicity without allowing the developers to actually work on the consistency of the story? How about you let developers explore the stories without breathing on their necks constantly? How about you let your imagination flourish and prioritize the game rather than the so-called public image or long-term profit? And don't get me wrong, I know that video game companies are companies first and foremost, but Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring have proved that when you prioritize the game before anything else, the gamers not only will come back but will spend more. When the quality of the story and the product are the priority, the people will start to talk, recommend, share, and publicize it for you. My father, as a wise man, once told me that there's no better marketing in the world than the consumers themselves. Love it or hate it, when people love a product, they will promote the hell out of it and more customers will come. But hey, I'm also trying to convince these kinds of people, the ones who literally gaslight, hate, and belittle gamers as the worst species on earth, while also trying to sell them products. Imagine if Apple acted the same way when people hated the iPhone 7. At the end of the day, I know I'm just one voice in a sea of opinions, but I hope this video adds something meaningful to the conversation. If you have made it this far, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this video, I would be incredibly grateful if you subscribed. I'm a small creator trying to grow, and your support makes a huge difference. I want to see if I can reach 5,000 subscribers at least by the end of 2025. After all, it's because of viewers like you that I can keep creating content like this. Also, let me know what you think in the comments. I would love to hear your perspective. This has been Juano, and thank you for watching.